Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we have discussed about the machine learning for machining and then importance of linear regression model and advantages we have discussed in those topics. Okay, now we are going to discuss about important machine learning model, that is support vector machine. So support vector machine is a supervised learning algorithm which learns from labeled data where you already know the correct answer for the input, and it tries to predict that for new data. It is mainly used for classification like separating cats versus dogs, and for under regression for predicting values, predicting continuous values, though it is very common in classification. Now we can we can see the concept of support vector machine at the diagram. So in the first diagram, so here we have two classes, class A and class B. So class A is represented in blue color, class A in pink color dots and class B in blue color dots. Okay, so we can see a straight line here. It is called a hyperplane that separates these two groups. So the goal of SVM is to find the best hyperplane that not just separates the classes, but does it with the maximum margin. So there is the most space between the line and the nearest point from each class. So in this figure, we could see that maximum margin hyperplane, that is the best dividing line. So first we should understand what is meant by margin, hyperplane and the support vectors. So margin is the distance between the hyperplane and the nearest data points, that is support vectors. Okay, then hyperplane. So there are two types in this hyperplane, positive and second one is negative. Okay, this is represented as boundaries, and it is the decision boundary that separates data points into different classes. So in 2D, it is the line, but in case of 3D, it is a plane. And in higher dimensions, it is a subspace. Okay, and finally, most importantly, support vectors. So the points closest to the margin. Okay, support vectors, data points closest to the hyperplane, influencing the position and orientation of the hyperplane. So these these support vectors are critical. The SVM uses them to determine the boundary. If you remove any one of them, the boundary could shift. Okay, so SVM is a very powerful tool for pattern recognition, especially when the data is not linearly separable. It is like finding the perfect line that balances between the two classes, keeping them apart as confidently as possible. And next one is classification versus regression in SVM. So SVM model can be used for classification as well as for regression. Okay, so classification, think of this as sorting stuff into groups. For example, we might want to figure out if an email is spam or not spam, or if a picture shows a cat or a dog. Okay, SVM help us to draw a clear line between the different groups based on the data. So we are basically asking which group does this belong to. Okay, and as far as regression is concerned, this is about predicting a number, which is that is continuous values. Okay, continuous numerical values we could able to predict with regression. Let's say we want to guess the price of a house based on its size, location, and other things. Okay, SVM could able to help us find a pattern, so we can make a good guess. So we could ask what is the value should we expect from the model. And here, so we are going to discuss about kernel trick for non-linear data. For example, we can imagine we have a data set of images of cats and dogs, and we wanted to classify them using SVM model. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to represent the data. Okay, each image here, that is cat and dog images. Each image is represented as a vector of features. The features can be pixel values, texture features, etc. And linear SVM. If the data is linearly separable, it can be separated by a straight line in a 2D plot. Okay, a linear SVM can find the optimal line that maximizes the margin between the cat and dog data points. And non-linear SVM, that is the kernel trick, comes into the play. If the data is not linearly separable, the kernel trick allows SVM to map the data into a higher dimensional space where it becomes linearly separable. Okay. So the common kernel functions include polynomial kernel, radial basis function RBF kernel, and sigmoid kernel. Okay, so that we will discuss in the next slide. And we should find the optimal, we will discuss the kernel functions here. So first one is radial linear kernel, and then polynomial radial basis function. Okay, so polynomial kernel is much useful for the data that can be separated by polynomial curves. So whereas radial basis function, it can be used for data that exhibits a sigmoid shaped separation. So when we wanted to use SVM, we usually try to draw a line or plane that separates different groups of data, right? But what if the data is not in a straight line? What if it is curvy or messy? So that's where kernel functions comes into the play. They help us to reshape the data in a way that makes it easier to separate. Okay, kernel functions are mathematical tools which can be used in support vector machines to handle nonlinear data. And why we need them? Sometimes we can't just draw a straight line between two groups. The data is all over the place. So kernels will help us to move the data into different space, kind of like changing the view where a straight line does work. The best part, we don't have to do all the math ourselves. The kernel trick will handle all those cases behind the scenes. So kernel help SVM work on messy real world data, and they transform the data quietly in the background so that we can separate it more easily. That's how SVMs can handle both simple and super complex problems. So it makes the data easier to work with, and it does save us from heavy calculation, and it can help it with complicated patterns. Okay, even if the data looks messy or tangled, so kernels can help sort it out by reshaping it in a way that a simple method like a straight line can still work. So that's all. So, and we will meet in next lecture.